so some of them in about transport and home zones and areas. And all of these policies have been quite important in taking forward the agenda of green and open spaces. And I don't know much about your policy system here, hope to learn some, but policies are very important. As you saw in the last presentation, having a local policy that decides to perhaps exclude a particular user group from a space can then be used to put into practice in particular ways. Okay? And so we had a range of policies that were very important under a government that was in power starting in 1997. It was a Labour-controlled government. And there was a lot of lobbying going on by people in the green space sector to say green spaces are very important. So here are some of the sorts of policies. One of them was called a planning policy guidance, and this was talking about the different types of open spaces in our cities and how important those are. And then the government had an urban green space task force, which I think I've mentioned briefly. We did some research that fed into this green task force. And it's a delight when you see a government document and in the first few pages some of your research findings are in there. It's a great pleasure. In fact, you feel, goodness, somebody's listening and making use of it. And then this had lots of recommendations for national government, for local government, for non-government bodies, as to how to make green spaces and better places. And there was a whole campaign, cleaner, safer, greener. I have seen some signs in your city that have greener, are they greener, safer? Or have I misread those? I think there's been some. So this idea of greener spaces and better places was a very big driver from national government, and it was associated with some funding streams as well. There was also a play lobby, so this is what I call indirectly related to our open spaces. A play lobby at a similar time to a green space lobby, saying to government, this is really important, you need to do something about it, you need policy for this, you need to put funding into this. And then linked in with these policy directives at a national level were also health agendas. So choosing activity, the Department of Health saying choose to be active. So choose active travel, that's cycling or walking to work, rather than just going in the car or the bus. And some of that was accompanied by the earlier policy here, which was about trying to get children to walk to school rather than going in the car. So a whole load of policies existed from 1997 onwards, well really from about 2000. It took a few years to wind up the lobbying and for that to become evident in policy. But within our city, you can see that we have a whole range of green spaces. And here they are all separate from each other. So we have a motorway that comes up and sort of goes around the outside of the city. This is the city centre where the Peace Gardens is. I was talking to some of you about shopping malls. The big shopping mall is here, out near the motorway, so it's accessible to people in other parts of the country. So this is another conurbation, a smaller one, and there's a couple of others around. This is a poorer part of the country much poorer than London and some parts of the south of the country. But you can see there's a lot of green spaces. Here they are along the river valleys, so there are moors over here that are covered in peats, and the river valleys come from the west into the city centre, and this is one of the things that helped develop the steel industry. So they all come down, and then they all go out in this one area. One of these is a canal, one is a river, and they go out through Rotherham and Doncaster, and they go onto the sea eventually, 150 miles away. So they come in from here and they go out there. So there's a whole area of the city where there isn't, where there are not the small rivers. And I hope this shows up so that you can see this is the built up area, and these are the moors, and you can see how that green that is, but you can see the green spaces. Many of these are parks, and in these housing areas, many of these have got gardens as well. So there are a lot of green spaces around the city. This is this was the steel making factories at one time, and now the shopping centre, the big shopping mall is there, which has had a dreadful impact on the city centre shops, in fact, but that's another story. So these green spaces, you can see a little bit more connected up here. And it's important that we try and connect them for lots of reasons. I've also, I think very early on, mentioned that we have a lot of street trees, and they are part of the connection of the street trees. And one of our big concerns at the minute is the council has a contractor who is redoing footpaths and roads. And actually, this is a very bad road. There are lots of roads in our city where they have not repaired them because they put the money elsewhere, and they're currently doing it. Now, as they're doing it, there is also a tree replacement policy, a street tree replacement policy, and there is a lot of public objection. So the trees with yellow ribbons on are trees that are due to come down, and the council is saying they've gone through a process, a structured process of deciding. And what I couldn't find, I'm sorry, is there's another road near here, just off Darren, where the whole street almost has yellow ribbons on the trees. And to take all of those trees down in one go is going to have a massive impact on the biodiversity, on the water retention out of the soil, and I don't think they've thought about this. There are areas of clay that go through this particular part of the city, and I'm just wondering what that will do. The visual impact will be very, very dramatic. If you can imagine a street that's like this, and then suddenly all of these are gone. There was one Sunday afternoon, it suddenly dawned on me as it was autumn, it would have been better if it had taken them a week before, because the trees had even more leaves on. I suddenly realised this might be the last autumn for 100 years with these trees, some of these trees in this place. So I rushed around and took some photographs around this part of the city. There's been a lot of local opposition to the way the trees are coming down, and people are actually the other week were arrested, including an ex-professor from our sociology department who they were studying, there was a red taped area and they were stood inside it. So the trees in the streets, and not all our city streets have trees, but where they do, they make an enormous contribution to biodiversity and to the amelioration of the urban heat island that we talked about in the first lecture. And so this is all part of the network of the green in our cities. So our city, as many others do, has a strategy for that. So when all these government policies were in place, all our towns and cities were encouraged to develop a green space strategy or a green and open space strategy in order to help them manage the stock of green space. So this isn't so much just about designing. And ours is, the development of a strategy like this took a long time, had all sorts of people, the health people involved in discussions and activity people involved, a whole range of people, different people managing spaces in the city. And they came up and they have themes of people, places, environment and sustainability, and quality management. But I just want to explore with you a little bit why you might do a strategy like this. And some of this information is taken from the national organisation called Cave Space, which existed for a 9-year period under the government at the time, and for whom I actually, they had a small staff in London and others of us around the country who worked for them and went into local authorities to help local authorities develop these strategies. I was the only academic who was involved in that way, and it was a great privilege to go and meet many people in our local authorities. So why do we undertake a green space strategy? Well, it helps to identify the stock, the amount of green space that we've got there to look after, and what needs to be managed. It also helps us to understand the quality of the green spaces. And in some cities there is a lot of green space that is not of good quality. So if you're using the Green Flag assessment tool that you've now become aware of, if you were to do a quality assessment, it would score very low. A lot of them are very poor on biodiversity. And to help identify improvements that might be needed and to prioritise them when funding opportunities might occur. So, aims of a strategy are to help create a network of high quality open space. Each city would develop its own aim, and it might talk about inclusivity, it might talk about biodiversity, it might talk about a whole range of things in its aim, depending on what the needs and issues in a particular city are. But these are some of the overall reasons for having a strategy. So to help reinforce local identity and civic pride, to help enhance the physical character of the area, to improve physical and social inclusion, including accessibility, to provide connected routes for wildlife, and I'm really worried about that with all the street trees that are coming down, for people, for recreation, for walking to school, to protect and enhance biodiversity and ecological habitats, and green infrastructure, and ecosystem services, this term of all the benefits that our green spaces can provide. But also the aims might be about providing for children and young people, to help raise property prices and aid urban regeneration. And what's very interesting on this in our city is the draft strategy for managing woodland, which is slightly separate from what's happening in the street trees, talks about trees close to properties increase the property value. So by taking all the trees down in one street, I'm sort of going, okay, does the City Council want all the property prices to drop by taking these out? I don't know. I don't think they thought it through. But this is some of the guidance based on some of the evidence about what green spaces can do. So a strategy might help boost the economic potential of tourism, leisure and cultural activities. I think that particularly relates to some of our historic towns, and to provide cultural, social, recreational, sporting and community facilities. But it goes on. So there's many reasons why we might develop a green and open space strategy. So to protect and promote understanding of historic, cultural and archaeology of places. To contribute to the creation of healthy places, including quiet areas, to provide popular outdoor educational facilities, promote the opportunities for local food production, help mitigate and adapt to climate change, and improve opportunities to enjoy contact with the natural world. So you can see some of these points in what the government was saying, these are good reasons for doing green and open space strategies, have been informed by some of the research that various people managed to feed in through that Urban Green Space Task Force. So it's a great delight, really, that research was taken and some of it was fed down into some of this. So this sort of thing about contact with the natural world, I don't think the government would have put in a document like this if that hadn't been brought to their attention by practitioners and academics. So a lot of aims for a strategy, and every city is not going to meet all of those. And some aims are going to be more relevant, but this is sort of overall guidance that was available and still is available if people can find it in the government archive sites for why a green space strategy is important. Then one of the things that local authorities were asked to think about in developing a green space strategy is who is responsible for that land. Okay, sorry, this is a photograph of a groundsman, and in our cities we may have many different people responsible. So even within our local authorities, they own all the land, but often it's a different department. So it makes it very complicated. And often those departments don't talk to each other. And there's politics between them all, unfortunately. So sometimes there are parks departments, sometimes there are leisure and sport departments, sometimes there's street cleaning, sometimes there's highway departments, and I found in working with this, with the local authorities, that some of the highway engineers found it very difficult to acknowledge that those spaces alongside roads, particularly not streets but roads and perhaps between cities or towns if you're dealing with a county, that those are actually part of the green space network. So we're looking at connections between towns and cities as well. Lighting engineers, arts and cultural departments, tree officers, children's play service officers, contractors, because some local authorities don't do the work in-house but have contractors, some have it for some work and not for others. Access officers, so people working with disabled people, and then of course utilities companies, housing associations. A lot of our cities have more than one person developing housing, and that's important. Sports clubs, we actually have not just big football clubs who own land, but there are some smaller sports clubs as well. Some of those are private, some of them are sports grounds that belong to the manufacturing industries, and many cities have this really complex mix of who is owning land. We actually have a set of national charities called wildlife trusts, who in some cities maintain land. They particularly maintain nature reserves on behalf of local authorities. Sometimes there are community groups looking after spaces, and then of course the planners need to be involved in all this, because there has to be a dialogue between the planners and the provision of space and the people who are going to then look after the space once it's developed. And this has been, in some instances, a very difficult thing, because planners and perhaps parks or whoever it is managing the green space have traditionally not talked to each other. So in the time of developing these strategies, it was a really important thing that the process involved more than one department. And I went into some local authorities and others of the people doing this. We went in and we would find people had never spoken to each other at all. Okay, because they're working what we call silos. So, preparing a strategy. There were a couple of government-led documents to help explain how to do a green space strategy, bringing a scoping study, writing a brief, reviewing the context, understanding the supply, so how much green space you have. A lot of our local authorities didn't really know that. They were cutting and mowing grass and looking after trees, but the records they had might be very out of date. A lot of them were not using GIS or other computer software. I can remember when I worked in local authority, it was all paper-based maps and some were held in different places. So understanding supply, understanding the demand and the needs. So that is, who is living around a particular space? Do we still need a play space here? Are there going to be children here in 10 or 15 years? Is this area becoming increasingly elderly people? We have some areas of our city that really have a very high percentage of elderly people. What does that mean for the open space? Looking at objectives and preparing a strategy and an action plan. And this is a process I go through in a very quick and short way with some of our students some of our postgraduate students on one of our modules. And this document laid out a sort of time frame within which different stages of a strategy should happen. And the time frames were all far too short, because when you get down to trying to get people to work together and to gather the information together, it takes a lot longer than I think the government thought. So in taking forward strategies like this, the planning policy guidance that government developed had a typology of spaces. So the typology I explained to you was one I'd been thinking about, which was from a user's point of view. This is from a planner's point of view. And in the research that we did for government that fed into the task force, we came up with a typology, and even three of us working on, as the main people working on this one project, could not agree a full typology. We had great discussions and debates about it, and what we put forward wasn't quite what came out here, And even this I would now question. So just to take children and young people, the previous typology had playgrounds, so at least this has moved to provision for children and young people, but I almost feel that what it needs is a layer of who the users might be, i.e. children and young people might play in many of these spaces. I actually think it could do the heritage layer as a separate layer, and that's something to consider because there isn't something about heritage. There's cemeteries and churchyards, but there isn't something about heritage sites. And a lot of our parks are heritage and historic, and that's enabled them to leave a mark on a particular national fund.